Divorce and the Fall of an Empire, A Tale of Betrayal and Vindicated Legacy, English translation. He smiled as he signed the divorce papers, the smile of a king bestowing pity upon the vanquished. Richard Thorne believed the prenuptial agreement in his hand was a steel wall, designed to strip the woman sitting opposite him of everything, leaving her only with fragmented memories. Yet, Judge Harding lifted the document, squinted, and uttered 5 words that made the entire room freeze. "This document holds no legal validity." Richard's smile vanished. For the first time that morning, he was stunned, realizing the shield protecting his hard-earned fortune was no better than a worthless piece of paper born of a lie. Before we dive deeper into the details, let us know where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our captivating stories. Richard Thorne pressed the Mont Blanc pen, the black ink gliding smoothly over the paper. He signed his name with a decisive curve, almost an artistic flourish. Then he leaned back in his chair, a half-smile playing on his lips. It wasn't the smile of relief, but the grin of a victor, one who believed he had calculated every move and that this game had reached its conclusion. Seated across from him in the cold, marble courtroom, Eleanor Vance did not flinch. She simply and silently watched the man who was once her everything, now a stranger with calculating eyes. He held the prenuptial agreement like an unbreakable shield, a meticulously drafted document intended to nullify her 12 years of sacrifice, leaving her with nothing but her maiden name. They said she would walk away empty-handed, losing the house, the car, and even the company she had poured her life into, but held no legal stake in. She was supposed to start over at 42, while he would casually marry his secretary and drive luxury cars. That was the ending everyone expected, because that is how these stories often conclude. The woman quietly taking a settlement and leaving the court. But this time, things didn't end that way. Eleanor did not flinch when Richard smirked from the other side of the courtroom. She didn't react when he winked as if to say, "You lose." Martin Hayes, Richard's lawyer, stood up, his tone as smooth as silk. "Your Honor, we are here to finalize a simple formality. A prenuptial agreement was signed, outlining the division of assets. My client, Mr. Thorne, will retain full ownership of Thorne Solutions." She simply sat still, hands clasped tightly on the table, while Tamika Jones, her lawyer and best friend, presented a timeline, evidence, invoices, contracts, and emails. She pointed out moments Richard had forgotten were documented. Photos of Eleanor meeting investors, bank statements proving her money funded the first shipment, and even handwritten notes with her signature, passwords she generated, and the spreadsheet Richard once mocked her for being too meticulous about, all now serving as evidence. The judge, silent for most of the morning, began taking notes. He paused twice to reread parts of the agreement. Tamika's voice did not waver. She spoke with the calm fire of someone who had waited too long for justice. Each piece of evidence chipped away at Richard's confidence. But then, Judge Harding held the document up to the light, squinted, and uttered 5 words that sounded like thunder in the silence. "This document holds no legal validity." Richard blinked. The smug smile, which had rested on his lips all morning, vanished like a candle flame catching the wind. The entire courtroom fell silent, with no immediate reaction. Time seemed to stop, a moment of sharp, chilling realization that the paper he believed was his amulet, the one that would protect everything he had built, was little more than a scrap of paper from a deception. His knee gave a slight jerk. Then, his jaw clenched so tightly you could hear a faint grind. Next, he turned away sharply, completely avoiding Eleanor's gaze. She still said nothing. The problem wasn't a flawed document or a forgotten signature. What no one, not even Robert, could have anticipated was that the prenuptial agreement wasn't just deficient. It had never been officially recognized. Signed in 2011? No. Amended in 2014? No. Throughout their years together, it had never once been formally filed in the county clerk's office records. It was just a fragile shield made of paper, and the moment the judge exposed it, it shattered like crystal. Eleanor's lawyer, Tamika Jones, stood up. She did not rush. Every movement exuded confidence. "Your Honor, this is no minor omission. This agreement was never properly notarized. And, most importantly, there is no record of it ever being filed with the county clerk's office as legally required." She paused, looking directly at Richard. "Legally, it is nothing more than a rough draft." Long before the noisy courtroom, the fierce legal battles, the pile of lawyers and files, there were only Eleanor and Richard. Two kids in Brooklyn, with nothing but patched-up furniture, borrowed Wi-Fi from the neighbor, and dreams whispered late at night over an old kitchen table. He was charming in his own way, a schemer, always planning, always maneuvering, as if life were one big chess game. She was dryly practical, careful with every penny, cautious to the point of being timid in every decision. They moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Crown Heights, no elevator, no air conditioning, just fierce ambition and a constantly failing old coffee maker. Richard spoke of legacy, of greatness. Eleanor listened, even when she was exhausted, even when the rent was past due and the refrigerator was frighteningly empty. She clearly remembered the fateful night they decided to start the business. They sat on the floor, surrounded by unopened moving boxes, with only the dim light reflecting off the screen of an old laptop. Richard was burning with energy, speaking passionately about the future, about million-dollar contracts, about his name echoing across the world. "We'll call it Thorn Solutions," Richard declared, his eyes shining, brighter than any light in that dark room. "Sounds powerful, doesn't it, darling?" Eleanor smiled, a warm and trusting smile. "Sounds great, but maybe it should be Thorn and Vance." Richard laughed, affectionately stroking her head. "Of course, darling, but to simplify the procedure, let's keep my name first. When the company grows, we'll change it. I promise. Thorn, Vance Solutions, or Legacy." Eleanor put her complete faith in that promise, and so she started working. She was the one who stayed up 3 nights typing out proposals. She was the one who made the first calls, her voice shaky but persistent. She stayed up late, devouring books to distinguish between gross and net profit. And while Robert comfortably claimed to be the founder, it was Eleanor who paid the electricity bill to keep the lights on. By day, she worked tirelessly at a small diner. By night, she worked odd jobs, answering phones, processing invoices, organizing their tangled schedule. When Richard landed his first client, it was Eleanor who sent the invoice, her hands trembling with both excitement and worry. When he completely forgot to prepare for a crucial presentation, it was Eleanor who stayed up all night, eyes glued to the screen, editing every single slide. One evening, while they were eating instant noodles after sinking all their money into the first shipment, Eleanor received an email. It was an acceptance letter for a master's program in architecture at a prestigious university, her childhood dream. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. Richard glanced over her shoulder, his eyes quickly scanning the lines. "Oh, that's great, Elle," he exclaimed, with a hint of reluctance in his voice. "But is now the right time? The company is in a life or death stage. I need you here, right now." He didn't ask. He issued an obvious, implicit command that couldn't be refused. And Eleanor, without hesitation, dragged that email to the trash. She told herself her dream could wait, but their shared dream could not. The company grew, just as Richard had predicted. They moved to a real office, and then quickly to a larger, more luxurious space. The first contracts were signed, thanks in large part to Eleanor's meticulous preparation of the files and her tireless persistence in following up with clients. But on the glittering business cards, in the congratulatory articles, on every prestigious award, only one name was announced and honored: Richard Thorn. The promise of a Thorn and Vance gradually faded, sinking beneath a mountain of excuses. "It's too much hassle to change the name now, dear. Clients are already used to the brand," he said the one time she timidly brought it up. The dream of a shared name died quietly in her heart. She built it all with him, brick by brick. But her name never appeared on any legal documents. Because, he said, it's just paperwork, my love. It will complicate tax issues. Don't worry, we're in this together. And Eleanor, in her blind love and trust, nodded. She let it all go. Because back then, she trusted him implicitly. She believed that love was enough, that building something meaningful together meant that when he won, they both shared the glory. She didn't demand recognition. She didn't ask for a salary. She didn't even demand to be listed as a co-owner. She just wanted him to succeed, believing they were building a full life together, not just a company. Even when the business started generating real money, Eleanor remained in the background, quietly running payroll, managing suppliers, and writing important emails under his name. She had turned down a job offer from a prestigious Chicago publishing house to stay in New York. She refused a graduate school spot so she could be ready for all-night brainstorming sessions and early morning investor meetings. She believed her time would come, that one day she would be acknowledged, not just as Richard's wife, but as his true partner. But then, the coldness began. The dismissals multiplied, and the silence grew heavier each day. He stopped thanking her, stopped listening. Meetings that once took place in their living room were now locked behind closed doors at an office she didn't even have a key to. She stopped being copied on emails. She wasn't asked for her opinion. And when she timidly asked about her role, about her future position, Richard merely smiled and said lightly, "You're good at keeping things stable, Eleanor. Let me focus on development." And so she did what she had always done. She kept things stable, so stable that they began to crack from the inside. Now, strategy meetings took place at exclusive clubs where she was not invited. "Just stay home and rest," Richard said, adjusting his silk tie. "It's just an investor meeting. Dry business talk. You won't like it." He began to dismiss her role. The detailed spreadsheets she carefully prepared were brushed aside. "This is too complicated. Let Daniel handle it," he said, referring to the newly hired chief financial officer. Her concerns about a risky partner were ignored. "You worry too much. I know what I'm doing." The climax came when the company won the Breakthrough Enterprise of the Year award. On stage, under the bright lights, Richard gave a passionate speech about his dedication and vision. He thanked the investors, the staff, even the coffee maker in the lobby, but he never once mentioned Eleanor's name. She sat in the audience, applauding with everyone else, a smile on her face, but her heart constricted. She was no longer a partner. She was no longer a co-founder. She was just Richard Thorne's wife, an invisible shadow, a legacy written in ink no one could see. And in that moment, she knew the promise of years past had turned to dust, just like the love she once blindly trusted. Then one day, the fateful envelope arrived. Thick, formal, official, delivered by a man with a poker face who wouldn't look her in the eye. The air in the courtroom was thick, chilling as if all emotion had been drained away. After the initial shock over the agreement's validity, Martin Hayes, Richard's lawyer, quickly regained his frightening composure. He was an old, cunning fox, accustomed to turning difficult situations around. Although the defensive shield had cracked open, he was determined to use it as a weapon to attack. "Your Honor," Hayes began, his voice saccharine but laced with fake confidence. "While there may be a few minor administrative shortcomings, the clear intent of both parties when signing cannot be denied. Miss Vance agreed to the terms. Her signature is right there. And that intention, Your Honor, is what truly matters." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat, but Tamika's hand lightly touched her elbow, a gentle reminder. "You are not alone." Tamika stood up, slow but powerful. "Your Honor," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the gravity of her words, "we are challenging the validity of this prenuptial agreement. We assert that the document presented today was never legally executed in any way. It lacks a witness signature, it lacks notarization, and most importantly, We have official confirmation from the county clerk's office that this agreement was never filed, not at the time of marriage, not since. Legally, it is as enforceable as an old shopping list. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. No one moved. Even the bailiff stood a little straighter, eyes focused. Hayes smirked, flipping through his files with a dismissive air. Filed or not, the intention is clear. Both parties signed. Miss Vance knew what she was agreeing to. Tamika was unperturbed. Her gaze, sharp as a razor, locked directly onto Hayes. Intention does not override the law, Mr. Hayes. New York State requires proper execution of prenuptial agreements. No notarization, no witness, no filing. That is not a minor omission. That is a complete non-compliance with mandatory legal standards. Eleanor continued to look straight ahead. In her mind, she clearly saw the day they signed that paper, right on the kitchen table, with no lawyer, no serious discussion. Richard told her it was just standard procedure. It just keeps things simple, he reassured her. You trust me, right? Now, that very simplicity became the fatal flaw in his arrogant armor. Judge Harding did not react immediately. He did not ask for clarification. He did not argue. Instead, he slowly reached for the document, lifted it with one hand, brought it closer to his face, and exposed it to the cold light of the courtroom. He did not say a word. He just held the document there, as if scrutinizing its very essence. Eleanor stood up when her name was called, her knees stiff, her hands slightly trembling at her sides as she tried to contain her emotions. The courtroom seemed twice as large from where she stood. She adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began to speak. Initially, her voice was weak, the sound of someone who had held too much inside for too long. But as she spoke, the words began to take shape, becoming clearer and stronger. The memories found their rhythm and flowed out. When Richard started the company, she said, her voice growing steady, we were 2 paychecks away from being evicted. I worked mornings at a small diner and evenings answering phones for a temp agency. I used my meager savings to buy him the domain name. I was the one who found the accountant, who sat with him through every stack of legal papers, even though my name was never on them. She paused, her eyes not looking at anyone, as if staring straight into her own past, then continued. I sent the email to the first investor. I prepared the presentation documents. I relentlessly followed up with them until they agreed to a meeting. I sat in the corner of that presentation, silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because Robert asked me to let him lead. And when the check cleared, he kissed me on the forehead and said, "We did it." I believed him completely. Your Honor, Tamika interjected, presenting a stack of documents. These are Miss Vance's personal credit card statements from 2012 to 2014. Please note the payments for web hosting services, design software, and the initial business card printing costs for Thorn Solutions. All were paid before the company had its own bank account. Each piece of evidence presented was like a pebble thrown into the still water of the lie. A chain of emails showed Eleanor negotiating with a supplier on raw material prices, a draft contract with copious notes in her handwriting, pointing out unfavorable clauses that needed changing. Richard began to fidget in his seat. This evidence wasn't a knockout blow, but it was uncomfortable. They were like small needles, constantly pricking the bubble of his arrogance. Next came a series of photos, low resolution but highly incriminating. Eleanor stood next to Richard at their first product launch, her smile still innocent. Eleanor diligently handing out flyers at a trade show, sweat dampening her hair. Eleanor smiling, exhausted, beneath the Thorn Solutions banner, her hair neatly tied back, an ID badge around her neck, a smile of sheer dedication. Following that were the bank records, a series of transfers from their joint account for business expenses, purchasing office supplies, domain hosting fees, and legal filing costs. All of this occurred before the company had revenue, even before the company had its own bank account. Martin Hayes attempted to counter, his tone still condescending. "Miss Vance," he said, his eyes sweeping over Eleanor dismissively. "What you have described sounds like the work of a dedicated assistant, a fully supportive wife to her husband, not that of a co-founder, correct?" Eleanor, faced with the scrutiny, maintained a strange calmness. She looked directly at Martin Hayes, her voice clear, every word as sharp as a knife. "Is an assistant permitted to make high-level financial strategy decisions, Mr. Hayes? Does a supportive wife need to independently research and master international tax law to negotiate with foreign partners?" "I did all of those things." She paused, her gaze sweeping past Richard and settling directly on the judge. "My name may not be on the papers, but my fingerprints are etched into every single brick of this company's foundation." Judge Harding listened in silence, his expression as unreadable as a still lake, but the pen in his hand was writing non-stop. At the end of the session, he looked directly at Tamika, his eyes thoughtful. "Miss Jones," he said definitively, his voice ringing clear, "this testimony is very noteworthy. However, the court requires more than just words and circumstantial evidence. The court needs official documents, accounting ledgers, and, if possible, testimony from others within the company to verify Miss Vance's role." Richard let out a sigh of relief, a triumphant smile briefly flashing across his face. He thought this was a small victory. No one would dare testify against him. The books had been carefully cleaned up to be spotless. But he had no idea that Tamika and Eleanor were already prepared for this very request. And in the shadows, there were those who had waited far too long to speak the truth. The battle on paper had just truly begun. Next, Chloe, Eleanor's sister, took the stand. She sat with her hands clasped together, her voice trembling but conveying an unshakable resolve. "My sister gave up everything for him," Chloe said, her eyes looking at Richard with anguish. "She turned down a prestigious scholarship just to be close to that Richard. She took care of his parents when they were sick, like a biological child. She handled every small task, from personal bills to company logistics. And when he started to grow cold, she still thought it was due to work pressure. She thought it was just a difficult phase, but I saw it clearly. I watched him erase her from his life right before my eyes." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, which suddenly felt too tight. The smug smirk was completely gone from his face. His lawyer, Martin Hayes, frantically wrote something in his notebook, but Richard seemed not to care. Then came the defense's rebuttal. The CFO of Thorn Solutions, a neat man in his early 40s, took the stand. "Miss Vance was present in the early days. Yes," he began, his voice chillingly objective. "But I have never seen her in a board meeting. She is not named in any official company correspondence. And, of course, she is not listed as a formal partner or employee." A ripple of surprise spread through the courtroom. Eleanor froze, the feeling of the ground collapsing beneath her overwhelming, shattering into pieces. She looked at Daniel, who was deliberately avoiding her eyes, with utter confusion, unable to believe it. Even Tamika, who was usually unflappable, was stunned, taking a few seconds to regain her composure. Richard Thorne, conversely, wore a look of smug, delighted triumph. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. The game was over, or so he thought. Eleanor's trump card had just rendered himself useless. Martin Hayes, his lawyer, smiled knowingly, the corners of his mouth curling up in victory. "Are you certain, Mr. Lee?" Tamika tried to salvage the situation, her voice trembling uncharacteristically. "We have emails showing." "Emails can be interpreted in many ways," Daniel interrupted, his voice steady, cold as if he did not know her. "Miss Vance may have forwarded information, but the final decision-maker and analyst was always Mr. Thorne." The trial recessed in absolute chaos and intense disorientation. Eleanor remained motionless, feeling utterly betrayed and humiliated to the core. Richard walked past her, bent low, and whispered into her ear just loud enough for her to hear. "See? No one is on your side. You are nothing, Eleanor." When the trial resumed in the afternoon, Daniel Lee was called back to the stand. This was the cross-examination by Richard's lawyer, essentially just to reinforce his morning testimony. But something had changed. Daniel looked pale, his hands clenched until his knuckles were white. Martin Hayes began with an easy, casual tone. "Mr. Lee, just to clarify for the court, you can confirm that all of Thorn Solutions' financial success came solely from Mr. Thorn's brilliant leadership, correct?" Daniel was silent for a long time, so long that Judge Harding had to intervene, his voice tinged with a reminder. "Mr. Lee, did you hear the question clearly?" Daniel looked up. His eyes were no longer empty. They were filled with agonizing internal conflict. He glanced toward his daughter, a girl of about 15, sitting in the back row, her eyes looking at her father with confusion and disappointment. This morning, on the way to court, she had asked him, "Are you going to tell the truth, Dad? You always taught me to do the right thing." That sentence kept echoing in his mind. What was the price of silence? A generous support fund from Richard to start over, or his daughter's respect something more valuable than all the riches? "Mr. Lee," the judge repeated, his voice now slightly impatient. Daniel took a deep breath, then looked directly at the judge, as if seeking an invisible forgiveness. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling but clear, each word like a hammer blow. "What I testified to this morning was a lie." The entire courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Richard shot up, his face drained of color. "What? Are you crazy, Daniel?" "Silence!" Judge Harding's gavel banged loudly, silencing all noise. "Mr. Thorn, sit down. Mr. Lee, please explain." Daniel closed his eyes for a second, as if steeling himself, then opened them. His gaze was now filled with determination and regret. "Mr. Thorn met with me last week," he began, his voice now steadier. "He promised to invest in my startup if I testified that Eleanor had no role in Thorn Solutions. I agreed. I was too desperate for money." He turned to look at Eleanor, their eyes meeting for the first time that day, filled with deep remorse. "Eleanor, I am sorry." Then he turned back to the judge, his eyes resolute. "The truth is, Thorn Solutions would not exist without Eleanor Vance. She was not just the brains behind the numbers. She was the company's conscience. She was the one who saved us from what seemed like inevitable financial disasters. The contract with Gintech, it wasn't me or Robert, but Eleanor who single-handedly renegotiated the terms late one night in a Tokyo hotel." He paused, took a breath, and continued, his voice heavy with significance, every word etched into the air. "And the real reason I left is because I could not be complicit in what Robert was doing. He set up shell corporations to evade taxes. He took company money to pay for personal luxuries. Eleanor found out and confronted him. That is when he began to find every way to push her out." Daniel slowly took a USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the desk in front of the judge. "I thought I would never use this, but my daughter is here today, and I cannot teach her honesty while being a liar myself." He set the USB down, the dry impact echoing in the room. Inside are all the proofs of dubious transactions, internal emails, recordings, everything. "This is the truth, Your Honor." The second bomb, a much larger one, had detonated. Richard Thorn slumped back into his chair, completely drained of energy, as if his soul had been sucked out. He had tried to buy silence, but in the end, he bought the truth, a truth that could sink his entire world of deception. The silence that fell over the courtroom after Daniel Lee's confession was as heavy as a velvet curtain. The small USB drive on the witness stand was like a time bomb, signaling the collapse of an empire. Though Martin Hayes, Richard's lawyer, tried to object, his words were now weak and lost. The truth was exposed, beyond concealment. Judge Harding took a day to review the new evidence. When the trial resumed, the atmosphere had changed completely. There was no longer tension, only the wait for an inevitable verdict. Richard Thorn was sitting there, but his spirit seemed to have flown away. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a vacant, lifeless look. He kept looking at his lawyer, then at the door, searching for an exit that did not exist. Judge Harding adjusted his glasses, scanned the room, and spoke, his voice emotionless but carrying the full authority of the law. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, including the crucial information provided by Mr. Daniel Lee, he began, "The court concludes. First, the prenuptial agreement between Mr. Thorne and Mr. Vance is void due to failure to comply with legal procedures." He paused, letting the words sink in. Second, and more importantly, the court recognizes the extraordinary, indispensable, and foundational contributions of Miss Eleanor Vance to the formation and development of Thorne Solutions. These contributions are not merely those of a supportive wife, but of an unacknowledged co-founder and strategic partner. Eleanor took a soft breath, her chest, constricted for so long, finally eased. Therefore, Judge Harding continued, looking directly at Richard, based on the principle of equitable asset distribution, the court rules. Miss Eleanor Vance will receive 70% ownership of Thorne Solutions, along with full ownership of the house at 12 Maplewood Street. Mr. Richard Thorne will receive the remaining 30% of the shares, along with personal assets and a cash amount from the joint savings account. A strangled no caught in Richard's throat. He stared at the judge, eyes wide, unable to believe it. 70%. His company, his empire, now belonged to the woman he tried to cast aside. He did not scream. He did not object. He just sat there, lifeless, like a statue drained of its soul. The world he had built had just collapsed before his eyes. Eleanor did not feel the joy of victory. She only felt immense relief, like a burden of many years had been lifted. But looking ahead, she knew another mountain had appeared. Now, she held the fate of Thorne Solutions, a company on the brink of scandal. The responsibility was heavy. The trial ended. As people began to leave, two men in suits, who were not lawyers, approached Richard Thorne. "Mr. Thorne," one said, his voice cold, "we are from the district attorney's office. We would like to ask you a few questions regarding the financial activities of Thorne Solutions." Richard did not even have the energy to react. He quietly stood up and followed them, his slumped figure looking small and pathetic. Eleanor and Tamika walked out of the courtroom, facing the bright afternoon light. "It's over," Tamika said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "No," Eleanor replied, her eyes looking far into the high-rise buildings. "It's just the beginning." She knew the journey ahead would be difficult. Investigation, rebuilding trust, cleansing the stain. But for the first time in years, she was not afraid. She felt a purpose. She was no longer a shadow, a forgotten name. She was Eleanor Vance, who had reclaimed her legacy. And now, she would write the next chapter of the story herself, a story built on truth, resilience, and justice. Her dawn, after a long, stormy night, had finally arrived. The court's verdict was not the end. It was just an earthquake, and its aftershocks began to spread, shaking a corner of the brutal business world. Sarah Jenkins, a sharp investigative reporter for the New York Chronicle, was the first to realize the true potential of this story. A divorce of a wealthy couple was nothing new, but a dramatic courtroom reversal that hinted at massive financial fraud was completely different. It was a journalistic goldmine. She sought out Daniel Lee, who was initially hesitant, his eyes still holding a trace of fear, but eventually agreed to meet in a small, secluded cafe. "Richard didn't just cheat in his marriage," Daniel said, his voice still heavy with unspeakable feelings. "He cheated in everything. That's his true nature. You need to look into the deal with Marcus Stone 5 years ago. That's when I started to see Richard's true face, the face of a blood-sucking devil. The name Marcus Stone was like a golden key." Sarah searched and found an old article about the famous tech investor Marcus Stone unexpectedly withdrawing from a promising joint venture with Thorne Solutions without giving any reason. The market at the time speculated that Stone was facing financial difficulties, but Sarah knew something was wrong. It took Sarah Jenkins a week to secure an appointment with Marcus Stone, a man who was usually very private and had completely retreated from public life after the unfortunate incident. He sat in his minimalist office, quietly looking out at the deep blue sea, as if separated from the noisy world. "I read about the trial," Stone said, without waiting for Sarah to ask, his voice calm but his eyes full of thought. "I'm happy for Eleanor. She is an intelligent and kind woman who deserves all of it." "Mr. Stone, why did you withdraw from that project?" Sarah asked directly, without beating around the bush. Marcus Stone was silent for a long moment, then let out a bitter, sad laugh. "Richard presented me with a groundbreaking technology, an algorithm that could change the entire game. I invested millions of dollars into it, placing both my trust and reputation. But then I was horrified to discover that the technology was actually intellectual property he had brazenly stolen from a small startup in Silicon Valley. He bought off one of their engineers. He bought off their conscience. When I discovered this disgusting truth, he not only showed no remorse, but also threatened to ruin my reputation if I dared to speak up. I chose to silently withdraw to avoid a dirty legal battle, a quagmire I did not want to sink into. That was the biggest mistake of my life, for not exposing him sooner." He opened his desk drawer and took out a thick file. "Here is all the evidence I collected throughout that time. Contracts, emails, detailed testimony from that engineer. I held on to it, waiting for the right day to expose the truth. Perhaps today is that day, the day when justice will be fully served." While the outside world was digging up Richard's dirty past, Eleanor had to face the chaotic present of Thorn Solutions. The first day she walked into the office as the new executive, she felt a suffocating silence. Employees looked at her with curiosity, fear, and deep skepticism. They did not know who she was, beyond the title of the boss's ex-wife, who had just won the lawsuit. Her first challenge was a company-wide meeting. Standing before hundreds of deeply confused people, Eleanor did not use flowery, empty words. She spoke directly to the truth, candidly and sincerely. "I know all of you are confused. You are scared," she began, her voice unusually firm and determined. "What has happened in the past few days has severely damaged our reputation and trust, and has taken a toll on everyone's morale. I am not standing here to promise unrealistic things, miracles that will happen immediately. I am here to say that, from today, Thorn Solutions will operate based on one core, unchanging principle: absolute transparency." She announced her plan: a comprehensive audit by a reputable, independent firm to clarify all ambiguities, a restructuring of the leadership to remove the bad apples, and the establishment of an ethics committee to oversee all operations, ensuring no one would ever dare to cheat again. She did not promise to fix everything immediately. She only promised to work tirelessly, dedicating all her efforts to rebuild a company everyone could be proud of, a workplace where people could place their trust. It was a long and arduous road, full of challenges. She had to face angry investors, partners who wanted to terminate contracts immediately, and a company culture that had been deeply infected by the lies and deception under Richard's rule. But Eleanor was not alone. Daniel Lee had returned, not as the CFO, but as a trusted advisor, a new companion on this difficult journey. Several core employees, who had long been silently dissatisfied with Richard, bravely stood by her side, providing valuable insights and quiet support. The New York Chronicle ran a major front-page story with the sensational, shocking headline, "The Empire of Lies, Richard Thorn's Journey from Divorce to Massive Intellectual Property Theft Scandal." Sarah Jenkins' article, with the irrefutable evidence from Marcus Stone, created a terrifying media and legal storm. Richard Thorn, after months of intense investigation, was finally indicted on a host of serious charges. His future would now be decided behind bars, in the darkness of a prison cell. Meanwhile, Thorn Solutions, under a meaningful new name, Vance Legacy Partners, was gradually regaining its foothold in the market, one steady step at a time. The company lost a few large contracts, but it attracted new partners who were deeply impressed by Eleanor's honesty, transparency, and unyielding commitment to ethics. The final scene is an image of Eleanor standing in her office, serene and strong. On her desk are not glamorous photos of a luxurious life, but a whiteboard covered with bold ideas and plans for the company's future. She looks out the window, where the city lights are glittering brightly, sparkling like new hope. She is no longer anyone's faint shadow. She is a founder, a talented leader, a resilient survivor. Her legacy is no longer written in invisible ink. It is being carved out, clearly and powerfully, by her actions, her resilience, and her integrity. The battle has ended, and a new journey has truly begun.